Hey guys, welcome to session 3 of the week. What I'd like to focus on today is lines from the play Blood Brothers that are quite easy to memorise and relate to the themes nicely. Because with Blood Brothers, you don't get any of the play at all printed in the exam. You have to write about the play from memory. To access high marks, you really need to have words to write about, so you have to remember some. I think the great thing about Blood Brothers is so much of it is songs. So if you listen to the soundtrack a few times, then you'll start to get lines sticking in your head from the songs, which is brilliant. But obviously you're also going to have to make a conscious effort to actually memorise some of these lines. So that's the process we're going to start looking at today. What are some good lines that we could write about? And I have picked out some here. I could have picked loads, but I've been very strict with myself and just picked a few that I think are really good. So all I'd like you to do as a starting point is to copy them down and to work out who says it and when. From memory, ideally, but if you can't remember, you have your good old knowledge booklet, which again is on Show My Homework, that you can refer to. The first one is the only one that's a little bit of a trick because it's 30 but looks more like 50. Now this one actually comes from the stage directions at the beginning of the play. It's just before it's introducing Mrs. Johnson. So all I could do for that line is copy it down and then write in note form, this comes from the stage directions, beginning of the play, introduces Mrs. Johnson. I don't want you to analyse, I don't want you to evaluate, nothing hard. Literally just copy down each line and from memory, where in the play does it come from, who says it, and who's, kind of contextualise it a little bit. Who is it talking about? If you can't do them from memory, as I say, check the knowledge booklet. Probably take you 10 minutes, so pause the video, crack on with that task, please. Okay, so a little bit of self-assessment then. I shall go through the answers. You can check that you got these right. If there's any you couldn't remember and you missed, obviously you can add. Listen, love. I think hopefully that was quite memorable. This one is the policeman and the milkman. So both characters kind of tell Mrs. Johnston off. And although love is an endearment word, isn't it? It's in a sense a nice word. When it's used by the policeman, the milkman, it's patronising her. It's telling her to shut up and do as she's told. So it's the policeman. Again, it comes from quite early in the play at the beginning when she's still struggling with poverty. And it's to Mrs. J. I'll just abbreviate that as that. I'll tell on you is an interesting one. That one is said by Mrs. Johnston. She says it to Mrs. Lyons because Mrs. Lyons has gone back on her word. If you remember, Mrs. Lyons promised Mrs. Johnston that she would take Edward, she would look after him, Mrs. Johnston could see him every day and it would all be very lovely. But very quickly, Mrs. Lyons' paranoia, her jealousy, means she can't follow that through. So she then sacks Mrs. Johnston, bans her from seeing Edward. Mrs. Johnston says, I'll tell on you, which is so childlike. Rather than just saying, well, I'm taking my child, she wants somebody else to help her out. But Mrs. Lyons very quickly says, no, you won't. No one will believe you. And Mrs. Johnston is forced to admit defeat. Dictionary, this one's said by Edward. And it said to Mickey when they are 7 and they first meet. And this is a new concept for young Mickey. I wouldn't let him mix with the likes of them. This again is our good old policeman. He says this particular line to Mr. Lyons. So if you remember, Edward and Mickey get up to a little bit of mischief. They go out, they're throwing stones, very naughty, but relatively harmless. The policeman comes along, he catches all the children, and we've got 2 juxtaposition scenes. The policeman goes to Mrs. Johnston's house and tells her that it's a serious crime, and if there's any more trouble from her lot, they'll be up in the courts. He then goes to Mr. Lyons, removes his helmet, calls him sir, is very respectful to Mr. Lyons as a man and a wealthy man. And he says, I wouldn't let him mix with the likes of them. Don't let Edward hang out with Mickey and Linda because the policeman perceives them as not good enough. The oil in the water. Hopefully you all know this line. I know in my class we've gone over it lots of times. The narrator says this. It's at the midpoint of the play. It's in that lovely montage section when the children age and they transition from childhood to adulthood. They reach 18. And we've got this wonderful symbolic metaphor representing the way that the children are going to be dragged apart. That Mickey and Edward, despite their kind of almost magnetic attraction to each other, their bond that kind of keeps them together, once childhood is over, other factors are going to tear them apart. This next one is just another sign of the times. That's said by Mr. Lyons. He sings it, and he says it when he's making all of his employees, sacking them all, basically. He's making them all redundant. And the key thing about that song is it's so jolly and upbeat. It's a song about making people redundant, taking away their jobs, taking away everything they've worked for, their only means of supporting their families, and he's singing it all jolly. Really showing us how out of touch he is with the suffering of his employees. He's unaffected by the crisis, and so he just kind of acts as if it's no big deal. It seems like jail sent him off the rails. Mrs. Johnston says this about Mickey. If you remember, Mickey loses his job when he works for Mr. Lyons at his factory. When Mr. Lyons makes a lot of staff redundant, Mickey is one of them. He's done nothing wrong. It is not his fault. He's just a victim of economic times, but he can't get another job. He's desperate to try and look after Linda, and makes that terrible decision to help to help Sammy with the robbery, which goes horribly wrong. Ends up going to jail, and Mrs. Johnston says that he's gone off the rails. This last one then is Mickey. It comes at the very end of the play, and he says it about Edward. Mrs. Johnston has just told him, "Don't shoot him, Mickey, he's your brother." Now, Mickey doesn't even seem to be upset about the fact that he's been lied to for his whole life. His response to scream, "I could have been him." So it really represents this idea, doesn't it, that Mickey feels he's been robbed of opportunity that he could have had if he'd had a bit more money. And I love the fact that Russell uses the verb screaming here instead of shouting. It's such a primal verb. Shows that Mickey's the pain he feels at his life being kind of robbed from him, and his opportunities to succeed being stolen by his poverty and circumstances of childhood. And then this is the narrator. This is the very last line or one of the last lines of the play. He's reflecting on what caused the tragedy. And rather than give us answers, rather than tell us what causes the death of the twins, he says, could it be this? Could it be that? Could it be what we, the English, have come to know as class? And really, I think most of us are answering yes, isn't it? That all of this misery and suffering that happens at the end of the play and throughout the play could have been avoided if the class system was fairer, if we had less social injustice. Okay, so my quick walkthrough then, what I'd like to do next with these lines, now that hopefully you've remembered them a little bit, is to match them to our theme words. So we've identified that the big topics, the big themes of the play are here. And all I'd like to do for each line is to decide which of these themes it relates to and what the big message is. So I'll do one of these for you. 30, but looks more like 50. We know that's obviously describing Mrs. Johnston at the beginning of the play, and it clearly relates to poverty, doesn't it? Because the reason that Mrs. Johnston looks so old is because she's been aged by poverty. The joy, change that font colour, the joy and kind of vitality of her youth has been taken by her poverty and her responsibilities. So we can say those two match together. As well as saying which one, I want you to say what the message is. So 30, but looks more like 50, relates to poverty. The message is that poverty steals youth, ages people more quickly because of the harshness of life. Okay? So line, theme, message. You need to come up with a message for each one. It may be that some of these lines you think relate to more than one word. So can you pause the video and do that now? Match them to their themes. Think about what the message is for each. Okay guys, I hope you found that relatively straightforward. Again, I'll go through the answers so that you can check yours. Listen, love. I would say personally that one most closely relates to the theme of power, because it's one of those lines that really shows the powerlessness of Mrs. Johnston, her complete lack of power and lack of respect because of her poverty, but also her status as a single mother, because she's a woman, because she's poor, because she doesn't have much control over her children, she has no power. And she's therefore, rather than for people who do have power wanting to help her, they want to judge her and patronise her. So that would be the message. I'll tell on you, exactly the same, isn't it? The theme of power. Because she has no money, she has no power, and she can be easily manipulated and controlled. Mrs. Lyons, because she has more money, she has that status that she can be more dominant. Dictionary, I think, relates to childhood and education. Edward's money, the fact he's grown up in a middle-class family, gives him a better education right from the outset. And the key thing about education is it's the doorway to opportunities. Without education, it's incredibly difficult to better oneself. But through education, you can achieve things. So Edward already has more opportunities of achieving things because of his childhood is richer and he has more access to education. I wouldn't let him mix with the likes of them. This is the class divide one, yeah? The policeman is directly supporting the class divide. He's directly saying that wealthy people, like Edward, should keep away from the poor, keep away from that riffraff, because it implies they're almost going to contaminate him, doesn't it, in some way? So here we see this theme of the class divide being presented in the way that authority figures within society are supporting the idea that some people are better than others. The oil in the water is also class divide, and suggesting that the wealthier people will always rise to the top. And that's what I think is clever about this metaphor. Oil mixed with water, it will never truly mix, will it? And oil and water will always ultimately separate. And that's like Mickey and Edward. As children, when issues to do with money and class don't matter because they're ridiculous social constructs, they mix. But as soon as they reach adulthood, they're drawn apart. And of course, when oil and water separate, the oil rises to the top. So again, we see that injustice, if you like, as well, of the class divide and the way certain people will always have more opportunities to rise to the top. It's just another sign of the time. I would say that is very much to do with injustice, the way that society is unfair, the way that some people, the poorest people, are more affected by economic policy they have no control over than the wealthy. It seems like jail sent him off the rails. I think that's also to do with injustice and particularly entrapment. Jail is a trap, isn't it? You can't escape. And it's a perfect symbol for Mickey's whole life. He's been entrapped by poverty for his whole life, which is a huge injustice. And that's what's explored through this simile. I could have been him. Again, I think that relates to injustice. If he had had money, he could have been powerful. He doesn't actually want to be Edward, does he? He doesn't actually want to be him, the person of Edward. He wants to have Edward's life, his authority, his respect, his ability to not struggle for everything he's got. So that shows us the injustice of this class divide and the injustice of society. And of course, this last one, could it be of what we, the English, have come to know as class, is class divide, isn't it? And Russell is directly challenging us as an audience to think about how the class divide causes suffering. It doesn't create a happy society for anybody. The working classes suffer the most, but actually we could have a more harmonious society if we had a fairer system and equality of opportunities. Okay, so obviously you can listen through to that again and make sure you've got that activity done. But that's all I wanted you to have got done on this tutorial, is to make sure that you've matched textual details to key themes. You also need to start thinking about memorising these lines, maybe putting them on some flashcards, testing yourself, so that you start trying to get these lines memorised. Thank you guys, bye.